Canadians woke up today to a trade war. This is not something that we wanted. It is unwarranted. It is wrong. It's illegal. And we are going to fight back. And Canadians are already showing that defiance. They're standing up for one another. They're showing that they want to buy Canadian. They're boycotting American. And this is going to be a difficult time. So I'm calling on, in this time, where workers are telling me that they are desperately worried if they are going to lose their jobs. We already have seen massive job losses in the steel sector as a result of the steel and aluminum tariffs, and now we're going to see across-the-board job losses. The impact of this is probably the worst economic attack on our country that we have experienced in our lifetime, and the repercussions can be devastating. People continually tell me, they literally don't know if I will be able to go into my next shift, if I'm going to be laid off. There are auto workers talking about when there's pauses on the auto line, which normally happen, some of the workers are wondering, does this pause mean that we're shut down and we're going to go home and we lose our jobs? And what does that mean for a person? When they lose their job, when you're living paycheck to paycheck, that means you could lose your home, not be able to put food on the table for your family, not be able to make your rent, not make your other bills. This is serious. Given the gravity of what we're up against, I'm calling on an emergency session of Parliament like we had in the pandemic. What we're witnessing could be worse than the pandemic, and very likely will be worse. But Canadians are ready to fight back, and so my promise is we should fight back as well as elected officials. So an emergency session of Parliament where we do three things. One is we need to put in place supports for workers. Workers are already impacted. We need immediate supports. I'm calling on EI to be immediately reformed so it is covering enough workers. It's a sufficient amount to cover people's bills, and it's quick. People can get it quick enough so that it can actually come in and support them. Secondly, we need to create good jobs in Canada. And so that build Canadian, buy Canadian plan at the federal level needs to be there so we can build more and create good jobs in this difficult time. And finally, I know while the Parliament doesn't need to be recalled to put in place the retaliatory tariffs, I believe we should send a united message as all leaders and all parties that we stand united together, opposed to these tariffs, and we're going to impose these retaliatory tariffs with a unified voice, denouncing Donald Trump's attack on our country. This is a time that calls for us to step up, to be united, and to fight back. And so I'm calling for an emergency session of Parliament to do exactly that. Ce qu'on a vécu maintenant, aujourd'hui, c'est une guerre commerciale. C'est une guerre qu'on n'a pas voulu, mais c'est une guerre dans laquelle on se retrouve. À ce moment, on a des travailleurs qui ont peur qu'ils vont perdre leurs emplois. Mais qu'est-ce que ça veut dire pour une famille qui a de la difficulté à rejoindre le debout? Ça veut dire qu'ils ont peur qu'ils vont perdre leur maison. Ils ne peuvent pas payer les factures ou les hypothèques. Ils ont peur qu'ils ne peuvent pas faire l'épicerie pour leur famille, pour nourrir leur famille. Donc, on est dans un temps tellement difficile, avec beaucoup d'inquiétudes. C'est tellement grave. Et c'est pourquoi aujourd'hui, je demande que le gouvernement qu'on rappelle le Parlement pour mettre en œuvre ensemble des mesures pour protéger les travailleurs, pour créer des bons emplois et pour dire avec une voix claire et unie que nous sommes contre la décision de Donald Trump et nous sommes d'accord avec les tarifs de représailles. C'est maintenant le moment de mettre en priorité les gens, les travailleurs, et je suis prêt de faire ça. With that, I'm ready for any questions.
Can you just elaborate more on what type of measures you'd like to see in support of workers or businesses? Are you looking for pandemic-style relief?
We're in what could be worse than the pandemic in terms of the impacts to our economy and to workers. So we need across-the-board supports for workers impacted. My first reaction now is we need EI that is actually up to the task. And so we've been calling for reforms for a while now. I want that to be put in place. EI that is quicker to access, that covers more workers, that is the sufficient amount so you can actually pay your bills. The current replacement fee or the replacement salary is not enough to cover the cost for many families. So we need an adequate EI to meet the needs of today.
Ça serait combien l'augmentation de l'assurance emploi? Vous voulez une augmentation de combien des montants en pourcentage?
Le but que j'ai pour l'augmentation, c'est une assurance emploi qui couvre tous les gens. Et à ce moment, ça couvre seulement 40% des gens. Donc, on a besoin d'une assurance emploi qui couvre tous les gens qui travaillent. Particulièrement avec la crise que dans laquelle on se retrouve, on a besoin d'une assurance emploi qui fonctionne. Donc, ça, c'est un niveau. Deuxième élément, c'est on doit avoir accès plus rapidement. Parce qu'à ce moment, il y a un délai qui est trop long, particulièrement quand les gens vont perdre leurs emplois tout de suite. Et finalement, le montant que les gens reçoivent, qui remplace le salaire, ce n'est pas adéquat pour les coûts dans leur vie. Donc, ce sont les éléments que je veux voir une augmentation.
Une augmentation de combien?
You want to vote down the government at your earliest opportunity. Do you still stand by that statement, and do you think now is the time for an election?
Now is the time to put workers first. We're literally in a trade war. And I can't imagine any opposition leader that wouldn't want to support a package to help workers impacted by this. We did that during the pandemic. We came together. We need to have that same approach now. So my answer to that is we need supports of workers first, put in place working, an election afterwards.
So what's the plan for, how long would you see something like that? This tariff war could go on for 4 years. So how long would these measures that you're suggesting go on for, and how are we paying for it?
So the employment insurance should be permanent changes to the employment insurance that cover workers when they're impacted. That is something that we've long needed, and so now I'm saying I want that fix in place now, immediately done, so that workers can count on it, so it's there for them. And then the measures in terms of the economic stimulus, we need it immediately. We need a short-term fix. And as we move towards building a more resilient economy, we can look at ways to adjust it. But there's no doubt with the current circumstances, our reliance and dependence on the United States and the trade war that we find ourselves in, we need to build Canadian by Canadian, and that is something that's going to be short-term, but I expect it to be a long-term permanent shift where we use the buying power we have to invest in our country.
What specifically do you need Parliament to return for? The EI reforms, does that require legislation, or isn't that not something that the government can do without Parliament coming back?
We saw in the pandemic that we understood the severity of the situation required us to come together to pass legislation to be able to support Canadians. This is worse than the pandemic. The potential ramifications of this trade war could have devastating impacts on our economy worse than what we saw during that period of time. And so we absolutely need to have the ability to come back to Parliament to get things done. And what I'm saying is I want supports of workers done first. An election is secondary to that. First, let's get the support in place for those workers. Let's make sure they get the help that they need. People are already losing their jobs, and then we can worry about an election after that.
You would need to see this legislation, or if it would require legislation, see it receive royal assent before you'd be comfortable going to an election. Obviously, if there was legislation towards that, it would die on the order paper once an election was called. So is that what you're saying? You'd need to see it become law or pass through the Senate and return back?
Yeah, I don't want just a lip service. I want protections in place for workers, passed and implemented, helping out people. We literally have a dire situation. 25% tariffs on our country will mean potentially hundreds and thousands of workers lose their jobs. So to Canadians listening, my commitment to you is I promise I'm going to fight to protect your jobs. I promise I'm going to fight to make sure workers impacted get help. And I promise that I'm going to put in place supports that I can do so that people who are worried about the cost of living that's already so high going up, I'm going to fight to make sure life is more affordable.
Juste en français, s'il vous plaît. Donc, vous vous engagez à ne pas faire tomber le gouvernement libéral jusqu'au moins début avril, si vous voulez qu'il y ait tout un appui là, qui soit mis en place pour les travailleurs. Vous engagez à ne pas le faire tomber pendant plusieurs semaines jusqu'au début du mois d'avril?
Ma priorité maintenant, c'est vraiment important, dans une guerre commerciale, au niveau qu'on n'a jamais vu dans notre histoire, je priorise les travailleurs. Je priorise le passage des protections pour les travailleurs premiers et puis une élection avant ça. Mais c'est premier, on doit après ça. Donc on doit avoir des protections en place pour les travailleurs et puis...
Des semaines.
Oh, absolument, on a besoin des protections. Si la question c'est quoi la priorité pour moi? Dans une guerre commerciale au niveau qu'on se retrouve à ce moment, ma priorité c'est les travailleurs. Et maintenant, c'est fait. Donald Trump a annoncé aujourd'hui, le matin, 12h01, on est dans une guerre commerciale à ce moment. Et avec des impacts désastreux. Donc, premièrement, on doit avoir des protections en place. Il n'y a aucune protection en ce moment pour les travailleurs. qui va vraiment au niveau nécessaire pour la crise dans laquelle on se retrouve. Donc, on a besoin de ça, premièrement, et puis une élection après ça.
Have you been in talks?
Do you agree that President Trump is trying to cripple the economy of Canada so that he can annex us? And was there anything that the government could or should have done in the last 30 days to avoid this?
In my opinion, there is nothing to appease Donald Trump that would have stopped this. He has made up his mind. He wanted to attack our country economically. The whole pretense of the border turned out to be not true at all. And he repeated himself again and again. He has said he wants us to be the 51st state. He said he would use economic pressure to achieve that. He is imposing completely unjustified, unwarranted, and illegal tariffs on our country. He is doing exactly as he said. So we have to take him at his word, and we have to fight back. And Canadians are already doing that. But it should be our job as elected officials to back up Canadians who are showing that resilience and that defiance by saying, yeah, we're going to be there for you as well. We're going to put in place a package of supports for workers, so we have your back if you are impacted by these tariffs. We're going to build more and buy more Canadian to build up an economy that creates jobs for Canadians. And we're going to have a unified voice to say we denounce what Donald Trump did, and we are together in fighting back with tariffs, that retaliatory tariffs.
Have you or anyone in your camp have had any conversations at all with government officials or the leadership contenders for the Liberal Party about this relief package, about any progress regarding that?
No.
Could that support for workers mean tax cuts? That's what Poilievre is suggesting, that the support would be in the form of income tax cuts or something of that sort.
Well, no, let's be really clear. He's been very clear about the tax cuts that he wants. He has announced... Not at all. I reject. He wants tax cuts for millionaires at a time when workers are going to lose their jobs. It's a ridiculous approach. He wants to put tax cuts that are going to help less than 1% of the population. I think it's 0.1%. Based on the government's statistics. And the average income of the people that are benefited from the tax cuts that he's proposing earn mostly $1.4 million or more. So no, that's a ridiculous, that's the capital gains tax cut that he wants to propose. That's what he's come out. That's a specific tax cut that he's talked about that helps a very, very, very small percentage of Canadians that earn mostly over $1.4 million. That's who it mostly helps. That is a ridiculous approach in the face of a trade war where we got steel workers in Sault Ste. Marie saying, I'm going to lose my job. We got auto workers in Windsor, auto workers in Oshawa, who every time their line shuts down, they think, that's it, I'm going to go back home. We got workers now across the boards that are wondering, what am I going to do to put food on the table? How am I going to keep my home? And Pierre Poilievre proposes a tax cut for millionaires. I mean, it's very on brand for Pierre Poilievre, but it is not what Canadians need right now.
To middle-class families or people making less, would that be something you'd be willing to negotiate on to get this passed with the Conservatives?
He's talking about tax cuts when people are losing their jobs. There's not a job. If you cut someone's taxes, they have no income. What's the point? I'm talking about getting people the protection in place that they need so they can actually survive. We're talking about survival. And Pierre Poilievre's talking about giving rich people a little bit of a benefit. What's the point of that? I'm talking about workers who cannot go back to work because these tariffs mean their job will not be there. Those workers are right now high and dry. There's nothing in place for them. There's no adequate. 60% of workers are not covered by EI. The government has not fixed that. We need to fix that now. And I'm calling on government to acknowledge that this is an emergency. Let's recall Parliament and put in place the supports that people need. We did that during the pandemic. This is potentially worse than that. So let's get to work.
On what basis do you say this is worse than the pandemic? Because a lot of economists would caution against that, saying at the moment we don't need emergency measures of that scale, which would lead to a larger debt and deficit.
Well, that's why I'm calling for EI measures to be improved, not the direct payments that we saw during the pandemic, but the scope and scale of the 25% tariff on our economy when the majority of what we produce, the majority of what we sell goes to the United States, and all of that potentially being shut down because it costs too much, is the gravity of that could be far more than the pandemic. There are items that we produce in terms of steel and aluminum. If the tariffs are stacked, as we know is potentially going to happen, it could mean that our entire industry gets shut down. The automotive sector, these are good paying jobs. All of those jobs would be lost. The impact is devastating. And it could be, is why I'm highlighting that, worse than what we saw during the pandemic, given the scope and given the breadth of what these tariffs could do. we've got to be ready for people.
Trump's reaction today to Canada's announcement that we would be putting in place retaliatory tariffs was to say that if we retaliate, he will add reciprocal tariffs on top of the retaliations and on top of what he has already done. At what point do we stop escalating?
We have to fight to win. And there is no other way to deal with someone like Donald Trump. He's a bully, and he's going to continue to use bullying tactics. So we have to fight back. I think it's really important to remind folks this is not a fight that we wanted. This is not a war that Canadians wanted. This is a trade war that's going to hurt Americans. It's going to mean that their cost of living goes up. It's going to hurt Canadians. It's going to hurt workers. It is bad. But the only way out of this is to fight back and to stay strong. So we have to fight back. We have to stay strong. And we also need to look for the future where we are less reliant on the United States. And that's why I've talked about the Buy Canadian, Build Canadian, changing the way we buy things so we use our federal dollars towards Canadian-made products, using Canadian content. We've got to really reshape our economy so that we're more resilient and look to other trade partners. But what we're up against right now is serious. And my commitment to Canadians who are watching this today is that I'm going to fight like hell for you. Thank you so much. Merci.
They had 10 years to fight with us, for us. What have they done in 10 years? Look at us now. This is all him and Trudeau's fault. And he already said he won't call an election. So he lied to us again. Just like he said he cut up the agreement with Trudeau and everything else. This guy's a sellout. Like and subscribe, everybody. God bless. Stay safe, stay warm. And I'll see you in the next one, my friends.